Welcome back. As we discussed earlier, today's Supreme Court opinion struck down Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act, concluding that Congress had not provided adequate justification for subjecting 9 states, mostly in the South, to federal oversight. The court, however, did not invalidate Section 5 of the Act. Now, this is the section which requires areas that have a history of discrimination under the old Section 4 formula to get pre-clearance for changes in voting procedures, such as relocating a polling place or redrawing electoral districts. Ding, ding, ding. So although Section 5 survives, it will have no actual effect unless and until Congress can enact a new statute to determine who should be covered by it. What could be easier to understand than that? Joining me for a heated discussion, I'm sure, are my esteemed panel. Joining us now is Democratic strategist, the great Basil Smikle, former senior advisor to President Clinton, who is now a contributor to TheNewYorker.com, the brilliant Richard Socarides, and Dean Obeidallah, political comedian extraordinaire and creator of thedeansreport.com. Gentlemen, I thank all of you for being here to talk me off a ledge on this. Basil, let me start with you. Is this just another SCOTUS punt, or is this really a decisive ruling?
No, this is a very decisive ruling, because what this does is to some extent, it punts the responsibility to Congress across the street. But what essentially they're saying is that the burden of proof on the plaintiff is going to be so steep as to basically eliminate the ability for anyone that's wronged or that needs to, that's going to have problems voting now because of laws like what they're doing in Texas. The hill is going to be so steep for them to climb. It's going to be almost impossible for individuals to fight to get their rights. Now, having said that, the question then becomes, does Congress have the guts and the wherewithal to go back and fix this?
Oh, I'm sure they can work together on that.
Yeah, you do see that happening? Because I definitely don't, and this is a very awful ruling.
It's an awful ruling, and Richard, as you well know, Congress did uphold this section under Presidents Nixon, under Presidents Ford, under Presidents Reagan, and President W. And those presidents have all essentially been rebuked by the current Supreme Court. Did the justices gut this bill deliberately, or are they, as they claim, just progressing with the times?
Well, it's very interesting what they did, right? Because they could have, in theory, done a lot more damage. It could have been the ruling could have been much more sweeping in scope. But it was essentially a very disingenuous ruling, I think, because even though they just took a little piece of the legislation and knocked it out and said Congress could rewrite it and that would be fine with them, by taking the piece out that they did, they essentially gutted the whole law.
Exactly.
And Congress is so dysfunctional now that Congress will never be able to come to any kind of agreement on this. So it was really with an awful lot of disingenuousness that they did this. They said that they kind of tried to sound like they were taking a middle ground, yet everybody knows, anybody who's paying attention knows that it was a very impactful ruling and a very bad one.
Dean, isn't it true that by saying we'll let Congress sort it out, they essentially just send it off to the cornfield? I mean, if Congress is going to have to come up with a new formula to make this work out, how could it ever happen in such a divisive atmosphere as Capitol Hill today?
It's not going to happen. And what's remarkable that when this was renewed in 2006 and reauthorized, the vote in the Senate was 98-0. Think about that, 98-0. That Democrats and Republicans, because there's a political price to pay if you were against the Voting Rights Act.
Exactly.
So if you're a Republican, this is the greatest thing ever. You now have the Supreme Court striking it down. You have states like Texas immediately within 3 hours saying we're going to have make more difficult for minorities to vote. They're not saying it like that, but we are interpreting it like that. Let's be frank. And so Congress will never agree. But thank good. Attorney General Holder said we're going to be very vigilant. The Department of Justice is going to be very vigilant, and you can be sure with the Democratic administration they will be. The next administration might be a Republican administration, not be as vigilant.
And that's exactly what Congressman Grayson said.
And I will say, the one thing I also want to do is not disaggregate this from other decisions that the Supreme Court has made. If you take this in conjunction with some of the desegregation cases over the last 10 to 15 years, especially parents involved, which was a case in Seattle in 2007, where the Supreme Court basically said you cannot consider race in desegregation policies. This is an ongoing attempt by this court to roll back civil rights, and it's
well, that's right.
Yeah.
And it shouldn't be a surprise. The president said he was, deeply disappointed. I think what he said, but not surprised really. We saw that this was coming. This is the impact of having a bunch of very conservative, old school, conservative men, mostly men, although we have some great women, on the court. And you saw how the court broke down today. This was 5-4. and the conservatives ruled.
Well, yeah,
the day.
and that's what we discussed with Reverend Jackson on the show earlier. And again, there were a few times the Voting Rights Act applied in the 2012 election. It's not like it's out of date. In Texas, where a federal court struck down a voter ID law saying that the implicit cost of getting proper ID would, quote, would fall most heavily on the poor. And in Florida, where a court decided early voting restrictions unfairly discriminated against African Americans. So, my friends, how can this act be construed as outdated when we see it was still relevant 6 months ago?
And in fact, in the dissenting opinion of this decision, they have a litany of cases where the Voting Rights Act and this provision has prevented disenfranchising minority voters. And some are very recent, the last few years, a whole list of them. So it's still relevant, it's still needed, and I mean, you only hope Congress do something, but if not, thank goodness now you can rely on the Department of Justice. But I'm really
we'll see
I
about
don't
that,
know
because
that you can rely on the Department of Justice, because there's a big difference between being able to go in front of an election, before an election, and get pre-approval, and having to go in after the election. And I think when they say outdated, when the court says outdated, they don't really mean that the law is outdated. What they mean is the thinking is outdated. This is the court saying today that, in their view, the country is at a point where voters don't need any kind of protection.
And tomorrow we're going to find out if these same 5 men think that the definition of marriage from 1620 is outdated, or if that's still completely relevant. So are you optimistic, Basil, about where the court might come down tomorrow on Prop 8 and DOMA?
You know, interestingly enough, despite what's happened today and yesterday on their decisions, I'm a little more optimistic about DOMA, to be honest. I may be in the minority on this, but I'm a little more optimistic.
Richard, are we looking at a Supreme Court that will say you can marry who you want if you're gay, but if you're gay, poor, and black, you might not be able to vote?
Listen, I'm optimistic tomorrow, too, that the court will strike DOMA. I'm a little less optimistic in the Proposition 8 case. I do not think we will have the broad ruling that we wanted, holding that there is a nationwide constitutional right to same-sex marriage, but it is only a couple of years away.
Okay, there's much more to go through, so stick around. My brilliant panel is not going anywhere because it's wretchedly hot in New York City, and we have great air conditioning. Stick around. I am joined once again by our esteemed panel of Basil Smikle, Richard Socarides, and Dean Obeidallah. Welcome back, gentlemen. Dean, I want to start with you on this one. Was today's crackdown on carbon dioxide a way to gain some goodwill with environmental groups, to sort of grease the skids and give the president political space should he decide to approve the Keystone Pipeline?
I think that's part of it. I think it's about him trying to assert himself and have an agenda and not be just reactionary to what's going on with IRS, with Edward Snowden, with Benghazi. I mean, since he's been reelected and his second term sworn in, it's been a defensive presidency.
Yes, it has
I think
been.
finally he's going out there and saying, this is the agenda, this is what we're going to talk about. And that's what I think it's about.
Well, yeah, but then, Richard, executive orders, it's one thing when George W. Bush does it, but this president, hold on, that's tyranny. I mean, by making this end run around Congress, will there be some blowback for the move?
Well, there'll probably be some blowback from Congress, but I mean, I think it's a good plan. But the president has a long way to go on this before he can assert any claim that this is going to be his legacy. I mean, people who in the environmental movement have waited 4.5 years for something like this, and they, they were expecting this right out of the box in the first term. So, it's a good plan. This is what we should be doing. I think he is genuine on the Keystone Pipeline, and I think that,
Genuine in how so?
Genuine in that I don't think he's made up his mind. Okay. And that I think that...
well, the lobbyists have it, yeah.
But I would be surprised if the Keystone Pipeline got approved.
Yeah. Would you really, Basil? Do you agree?
I agree with that, and I agree. I think he's trying to get back on message. And not that this is a wrong issue to do it. It's a great issue. I don't think it's going to become part of his legacy. But the one thing I will add is if you could do this by executive order, I like to see that, because I like the president realizing that he has power in the office and exerting that kind of power.
God knows the last one realized it too. And,
yeah, I think he should be doing that more.
Well, you have to love his passion, though, in this speech, and the way he talked about it for my family, for our children, there's a passion in him that really was moving, and I think that was great to see.
I agree.
And executive order may be the only way with this Congress. You get nothing through this Congress.
Exactly,
nothing.
and I recommend everyone watching, the sexiest audience in basic cable, go to whitehouse.gov and read what the White House has put about this plan, because it's really, really great. Now, I wanted to know what Al Gore felt about this, but shockingly, he's not returning my call. So when the economy is bad, you always hear people saying things like environmental issues are luxury issues. Basil, I think that's a stupid argument, but do you think that that is a legitimate case of what we're facing today, that people are less concerned about the air and the water we take in because the economy is so challenged?
You know what? I think they care about it in the context of Superstorm Sandy, for example. They care about it in that context. If you look at what's happening here in New York, the mayor's always talked about green jobs and so on. And sometimes, and the president's talked about that as well, and it doesn't resonate as much as just jobs, and education, in particular, for example. But I think when you tie it to Sandy, when you tie it to Katrina, when you tie it to loss of life and loss of property, then I think people do understand. I think they will pay attention. I don't necessarily think they make the connection to jobs and prosperity with this.
I agree.
But they do connect it to just sort of this sense of security in terms of home and lifestyle.
I would say, and I'm not disagreeing with you, but it is really a false choice. What we have to realize in this country is that thinking about this in terms of jobs versus the environment, it's a false choice because we have no options but to deal with climate change now, because otherwise we're not going to be talking about jobs.
No.
We're going to be talking about flooding,
we're talking about food
and water and survival. So I mean, there's going to be no talk about jobs unless we deal with
the only
climate
jobs
change.
will be building FEMA trailers. And speaking of topics that can define a presidency, and I don't mean that lightly. Well, my ad-libs are all heavily rehearsed. But speaking of issues that define a presidency, I want to turn to the IRS scandal, because it seems like, well, it isn't. And the directions that IRS officials were given to look for applicants seeking tax-exempt status with Tea Party and Patriots in their title, well, shocking, gentlemen, it also included titles such as Progressive and Occupy, according to IRS documents released Monday. Now, apparently officials were trying to use keyword shortcuts to find overtly political organizations, so instead of a conservative conspiracy, we now see that the IRS is an equal opportunity scrutinizer. And now the question revolves around the IRS sorting tactics and these keyword targets. So, Richard, it seems like the IRS scandal is finally gone. It's a dead issue. Darrell Issa has something new to cry about. And it seems like all along, in spite of what the president said in his apologies and firing the guy who had nothing to do with it, they were just doing their job and making sure that these organizations pay taxes like we do.
Well, yes, with a footnote. I mean, I don't think that they were probably doing their job correctly, because I think that there should not be a issue-based test on any of this, right? The test ought to be whether you're on the right or whether you're on the left. Are you obeying the law and engaging and not engaging in political activity, or not any more political activity, not any greater percentage than you're allowed to? But this was what the IRS was doing was clearly not aimed at conservative groups. It was aimed at any group. And it was just done in an improper and sloppy way. It was a totally nonpartisan screw-up.
Dean, isn't that their job?
It is their job, but it seems, and I hate to be questioning the veracity of this, but it's a little late in the game for all of a sudden it comes up, and oh yeah, we had liberal groups as well. Why didn't this come up before? To me, it seems like they're covering for themselves more. And I know it's a new IRS commissioner. He got in there, and he goes, well, this is what I found. Why didn't we hear about this earlier? For me, I mean, why not say it? Because they could have ended the whole thing. We went after conservative and progressive groups. We looked at conservative boards.
Well,
and
we got to go to break, so let me give Basil the last word. I mean, why did the president let himself be a punching bag on this issue for a month if all along there was no singling out?
My guess is he probably didn't know all that was there.
You're saying he was out of the loop?
I was saying he was out of the loop.
Well, I think in this case it's a good thing. And up next, we're going to be honoring a Washington insider for his huge, massive testicles. That's right. You don't want to miss it.